there be any acceleration, or should there be any point or second phase of COVID-19? Now, surveys of properties has also been similarly like viewing and inspection, essentially being put on hold as well, and it's only been possible where there's been empty properties. Most lenders and even valuers and surveyors tend to do desktop valuations. I'm not too sure about any kind of desktop surveys or such, but from an evaluation point of view, most definitely those have been happening, although a lot of lenders have been putting on hold valuations regardless anyway, desktop or no desktop. Now, lenders generally, again, this has impacted in the context of lenders, residential conveyancing. Now, those of you who have recently completed a mortgage, no doubt may have heard or may have been contacted by your lender, essentially offering any assistance by means of mortgage payment holiday, which is generally 3 months. And this is generally capped until June 2020 and may be extended by the government and or your lender, etc. So you would need to refer to your lender. And these kind of holiday payments for mortgage, particularly and those that have recently completed, do only relate to residential and buy-to-let mortgages only. And should there be a payment holiday offered and you're eligible, then that won't affect your credit history. And of course, like with any kind of holiday, in this instance, they're referring to it as a deferral of interest. You would still owe the money. It'll simply be deferred, either put towards the end of the mortgage term or as your lender advises. Now, one thing that has really helped the mortgage in the context of mortgage for those people who are not yet completing on their mortgage, but who have exchanged contracts legally, but now haven't physically moved into their properties, and who are possibly nearing the expiry of their mortgage. Well, one of the assistance provided by lenders is to extend mortgage offers by 3 months for homeowners, which essentially allows and takes a bit of pressure off the chain where there is one, for people to essentially delay completion, basically, because one reason why people would want to complete COVID-19 or no COVID-19 is that their mortgage offer is going to expire, basically. Now, obviously, something like this will need the consent of all parties, and obviously, there's always lenders' discretion involved with such matters. If you can still apply for mortgages, of course you can. Again, that's impacted in the context of residential conveyancing in the mortgage market to the extent that whilst mortgages are available, however, you may find, and I think this is blanket across the board, that most lenders are capping the loan to value, for example, 75% or 65% borrowing permitted only. And obviously they're withdrawing certain products, and because of staff shortages, etc., a lot of lenders are doing that for those kind of reasons, because they need to concentrate their resources in terms of serving not only their existing client base, but any new client base. Now, that said, like I've said in my slide, lending is available, so feel free to approach your lender. And one of the biggest differences, like I've said, is compared to the credit crunch of 2018, is that the banks have money to borrow, basically. There's not a liquidity issue as such, basically, or nothing that's been reported in the media as such. Now, coming on to the second point, how does buying and selling in these COVID-19 sort of circumstances affect, for example, a typical firm like ours, where most firms would want ID, etc., and some offices are open, some aren't. Well, in our particular instance, for us, ID is such an important part of the whole sort of transactional property buying and selling concept. So for us, there's still normal ID requirements, and we are, like with a lot of people out there, maybe more so than others, turning to technology, things like Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, WhatsApp, etc. Obviously, where there is difficulty in getting ID, now this may not necessarily apply to all firms, but with our particular firm and our manager director, Mr. Turner, who is also the money laundering officer, we can assess each case on its merits and circumstances with a view to seeing if we can in any way work around our normal requirements for ID, which is certificate copies, our primary ID, which is essentially photo ID, and secondary ID, which is essentially address ID. Now, one of the implications of COVID-19, especially for the property market, has been a lot of offices, estate agents, sell suites, etc., from builds, etc. They've all essentially more or less closed, basically, or if they are operating, they're operating remotely, not necessarily physically in terms of office opening. Well, we at Garner and Hancock, maybe there's a few other firms that possibly are doing it, I'm sure, have always remained a physical presence in the office for our clients, for not only to drop off documents, but also, for example, if there was any ID certifying that was required. However, as a result of the recent government announcement, more and more staff have now come back into the office at our particular office, and no doubt with other offices now. So, although with Garner and Hancock in particular, we are still working remotely as well. But essentially, with all departments, there are staff present at the office, and any appointments must be by prior arrangements. The obvious reason is because of social distancing, protective measures, etc., which we apply, and it's for the safety of not only for you themselves, but also for staff who are in the office, basically. So in our particular instance, feel free to pop into the office, whether you're an existing client or new client. There will be someone there to see you by prior appointment. Now, one of the things that we've got at Garner and Hancock, for example, which has helped a lot of our clients in COVID-19 circumstances, is we do have a 24-hour letterbox, which is essentially on the front wall next to our front door, basically, of our offices. So even if no one's at the office, including out of hours, of course, clients, if they're popping out for a bit of exercise and if they're local, etc., they can easily pop down documents. And I think more so now, that's more important now that travel restrictions have been slightly more relaxed than maybe before, basically. Now, going on to the third point, transaction. Now, this is where in COVID-19 has really affected a lot of transactions, and possibly one of the reasons why a lot of firms may have possibly closed down, because some firms possibly didn't know how to handle things, basically, like COVID-19 and the practicality of exchange, possibly, because it can get very, very serious. Now, what do I mean transaction? Essentially, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, we always advise clients to carefully consider whatever date they are considering to move in or complete on fixed date completion, and if they want a gap or not. But it's more so important now with COVID-19. The main reason is there are risks if you enter into a legally binding contract, particularly with a gap of 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, which is typical. And then you find out, for all sorts of reasons, which I'll come on to in the next couple of slides, that you are not able to complete, not necessarily your fault. It could be the chain or the other party, and that causes a breach of contract scenario. So I'll touch a bit on that as well in the coming slides. So one of the reasons that we are sort of promoting a same-day exchanging completion with conveyancing matters, and one of the reasons why it's important to carefully consider a fixed date completion without any gap is obviously we all want a smooth as possible move and to avoid any risks that I'll come on to, basically, and we want to avoid breach of contract. Of course, if there is a breach of contract due to COVID-19, then the defaulting party, whoever's at fault, will be served with a notice of failure to complete. Now, so what will happen? How will you be liable, or what will be your loss if you unfortunately are in the circumstances of breaching your contract, not completing by the contract time, which typically is 1:30 on the date of completion, which is the fixed date of moving in and out, depending on if you're selling and buying, etc. So, like I mentioned, if for any reason, because of COVID-19, and I'm coming on to the reasons in this next slide, you're not able to complete, then a notice of failure to complete will be served. You're given essentially 10 working days to complete, which amounts to 14 days. And if completion doesn't take place, the contract is terminated, in other words, brought to an end. Now, Interest typically in all contracts is 5%, which works out around £70 a day on a typical sale price of 500,000. So you can see, just from an interest point of view, for every day times it by 14 days, it can get costly, £814 just for not completing in that extra 14-day period. Now, if you are a buyer, of course, you will end up losing 10% of your deposit. So there again, you can see, if you're buying for 500,000, you put 50,000 deposit straight away, you can lose that at the end of the 14-day period if you're still not willing and able to complete or cannot complete. Obviously, if you're a seller, at the end of the 14-day period, the deposit must be returned to the buyer. Now, this is where it can get really costly, and this is why, coming back to my earlier slide, it's extremely important whenever you're exchanging and completing COVID-19 times or not, and particularly more so in COVID-19 times, is that there can be a separate claim outside of the contract, which is which can be taken by the party that's claiming against the party that's defaulted, to be compensated for damages in the general sense, basically, which are consequential losses suffered and flowing as a result of, say, your breach, basically, for not being able to move out on the fixed completion date. Examples of these include removal charges, storage charges, legal costs incurred, alternative costs, alternative accommodation, etc. Of course, under the law, there is a general duty to mitigate such losses, etc. Now, coming back to some of the reasons why it's important that you have and be very careful, especially in these COVID-19 circumstances, to make sure you are happy with the completion date that you're picking, shall we say, and try to avoid a gap is as follows. Clearly, as you can see from the bullet points, there's a number of reasons. It's not exhaustive, many others, but generally you will find, if you've got a gap, you might find, if you're in a legally binding contract, that the seller is not able to be vacant possession on the fixed date of completion, or the buyer or seller is unable to complete due to lockdown restrictions. And more seriously, the party that you're buying off or selling to may be in self-isolation and may have contracted COVID-19. Things like removal vans, I've seen it happen. These are cancelled 24 hours before even the fixed completion date. And these can happen under normal circumstances as well, don't forget. COVID-19 or not, basically, but it's very rare. Banking difficulties can happen again. That would prevent completion. Cannot happen if monies can't be transferred. You may lose your job, and I hope that doesn't happen to anyone listening in, or generally, because it's a worrying time if you do, especially if you're looking to move and sell and you've got your aspirations in that regard. So redundancy, bankruptcy, leaving your job could be a reason, basically. And these are all factors that are beyond your control as well. Now, your lender may withdraw the offer as a result of your changing circumstances. For example, you go bankrupt, you've lost your job. Firms are closing as well, like, not many, but the odd firm that does close, that can cause an issue, and it's got nothing to do with you, basically. Now, going on to the next slide, some of the measures that we've been adopting here at Garner and Hancock to protect our clients' best interests, including lenders, and to counter any potential risks and costs and losses, particularly to you as a client, and to be quite honest and fair to the rest of the chain, because it's in their interest as well. Because we're all going for the same goal. We all want to strike the deal and get what we pay for, basically, depending on which side of the fence we are buying or selling. Now, so there's points to consider. Now, there's essentially three ways that in this COVID-19 circumstances where there's been a lot of activity, basically. There's been some firms who have preferred and adopted this option A, which is contractual clauses, entering into additional contractual clauses, which essentially are saying, put simply, that should the matter not complete, then to avoid anyone being in breach of contract, like I was discussing earlier, that the contract clauses agreed would allow parties essentially to come out of the contract. But with these contracts, generally they exclude parties' contractual liability to claim any losses anyway. Some of the things I've just discussed earlier. So these clauses, whilst might sound good in theory, in practice, they're a bit pointless because they're a bite without bark. And all you're doing is you're simply tying yourself into something that you may not, there could be a better option. You may not want to do that because inevitably with a lot of these contract clauses, there is what's called a non-stop date clause entered into, which essentially means that if for any reason there is or there's no completion on a fixed given completion date, then providing that isn't delayed beyond whatever date is agreed, and it could be 3 months down the line, then parties go back to the same position as they were before entering into the legally bound contract, which is before exchange. Now, the most favoured option, and the one that I have been really advising clients on to, should we say, consider as a serious option, is the same-day exchange and completion date. This has a lot of benefits, in my view, both particularly practically, basically. And I have found in my communications, not only with clients when I'm advising them, but with parties I've been dealing on the other side, lawyers, for example, they also seem to favour this as well, for the reasons that you're not, first of all, tied into a contract. Secondly, if any of the unfortunate circumstances that I've outlined, the risks, for example, losing your job, or you're not able to give vacant possession, or if you are self-isolating, etc., then you have that flexibility to walk away essentially without the worry of being tied into a legally binding contract, and without the worrying that you would owe anyone anything, basically, or you will be sued upon as a result of not, honouring your part of the bargain to complete on the day. So applying this same-day exchange and contract, so essentially the way this would work is we would do everything that we would do as if we had exchanged, say, this week and we're completing next week, except so we would set up the file in the same way, we would do everything in the same way, leading up to that fixed moving in or out day, except rather than exchanging, say, a week before, 2 weeks before, we do it all on the same day. But everything else, for practical purposes, like ordering monies, getting whatever is required from the client, the balance required to complete, etc., or anything else, is all done leading up to that date, and on the same day, everyone exchanges something. That severely reduces your risk. That's not to say that there isn't any risk. There still are some of the risks I've outlined. However, it's less so than if you have a gap. Now, in my particular example, since middle of March, I've done a number of completions now adopting this method, and they've all been virtually 100% successful. Now, the second most favoured option is for people to exchange and complete once government movement travel restrictions are lifted or relaxed, and you'll see more of that option C now with the recent overnight changes, reference travel and movement by the government, especially essentially opening up the market now. Coming on to the fourth point very quickly, the Land Registry have also practically introduced requirements and restrictions when it comes to, or lifted some of the restrictions when it comes to trying to assist parties when it comes to registering documents or accepting documents for registration. Generally speaking, documents have to be signed and witnessed, especially deeds, and the solicitors must always hold the original, basically, by the date of completion, because after completion, these documents need to be sent off to the Land Registry for registration. However, the Land Registry, there's a case by the name of Mercury, which introduced the idea of accepting electronic signatures. Now, the Land Registry are accepting electronic signatures, essentially that rather than having the original document on the day of completion from the client. So, for example, a client can sign, providing they're signing the document using their pen, it needs to be a wet signature, they can sign, witness, get that document witnessed, providing it has to be a complete document. You can't just send the signature page, and it must be in a PDF type format, and that could be emailed to your solicitor, and that would be sufficient. You don't need to send the original. However, the land registry are still requiring that deeds, as they are currently under the law and they have been for decades now, would still require a physical witness to be present when signing a deed, like a transfer deed or mortgage, which are the most common documents, basically. Now, obviously, anything like this, coming back to the other point, the restrictions on protective social distancing measures still apply, and you must exercise those. I mean, there's various ways people are doing this, basically. Some people are standing outside each other's doors, other people are leaving documents, are in the same room, but they're keeping the social distances, they're using cars, etc. Or screens, shall we say, like, where they can see each other, but they can sign a document in the presence of a witness, and the witness will then accordingly sign. Now, these are temporary measures, and the land registry have made clear that these temporary measures for accepting electronic signatures can be removed with 24 hours notice. And with reference to electronic signatures going forward, there was a Law Commission report last year, 2019, which has recommended electronic signatures be introduced generally. However, in the context of deeds, etc., and landlord, there hasn't been no definitive ruling by a court, and the government are yet to fully consider and implement some of the Law Commission recommendations, including electronic signatures. No doubt they'll do that in the foreseeable future, and most likely after COVID-19 restrictions have all been lifted, and we're back to normal most likely next year, and it's yet to be introduced in any kind of statute or in any kind of law made by Parliament, basically. Now, finally, the future and how it's impacting on COVID-19, property market and generally conveyancing. Well, like I pointed out there, the property market has always relied on confidence, people's attitude as well, employment, supply and demand, general wider progression of the economy, country and investment. And I'm sure we're all feeling this in some way or another, especially with the latest announcements, which I should say freeing up the markets a bit more than they were. And we've seen what can happen with COVID-19 and the restrictions. Confidence goes down, there's potential employment issues, supply and demand goes down. And obviously the economy comes to a bit of a halt, although hopefully that's not the case now going forward. So my next slide is essentially saying and looking into the future that whichever way we look at it, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, people always still need to buy and sell, remortgage. There needs to be lease extensions that still need to happen for flats. People need to move for all sorts of reasons: lifestyle, relocation, schooling, work, retirement. Whether it's COVID-19, whether there's a recession, whatever, basically, whatever's happening. So, in other words, life must still go on. Obviously, life comes to a bit of a standstill when you've got something like COVID-19, or you've got scenarios like the financial crash, basically, etc. That said, I mean, I suppose the good thing that COVID-19 has made a lot of people realize practically is to appreciate and value outside space, especially gardens, patios, and balconies. And no doubt, looking forward, when people are buying and selling, that's something that they will not only look for, but they would value where possible, basically. Now, just sort of concluding, generally speaking, looking into the field, the property sector has and always will continue to evolve, as it always has, regardless, since World War II, despite recessions, financial crises, etc. And it has done so progressively. Like with any evolution, it's done so progressively, and especially more so in the last 10, 15 years with the impact of technology. And I touched earlier on electronic signatures, which is probably going to be the next best thing, maybe next year or the year after, etc., which will make life easy for all concerned. Now, that said, in an ideal world, once a vaccine is discovered, hopefully in the next 6 to 12 months, I would like to think, from what I am hearing, things should resemble some sort of normality that we were seeing prior to March, basically, earlier this year, in terms of buying and selling. That is not to say that it won't happen any sooner. That is not to say that won't happen as of today, because I'm sure it will start happening as of today. Just looking at the last point there, is it business as usual? Well, if it's not quite yet felt, I'm sure it will be, because it will be business as normal, even if it's business as a new normal, or most probably, which I think what a lot of people are predicting, at least for the short term, there'll probably be a combination of both. There'll be business as normal, hopefully starting today, and a bit of a business as new normal, which really is in the context of the restrictions, travel and movement that we're all facing until a vaccine is found, reference COVID-19. Now, there's been updates, and no doubt everyone has heard in the media, but just to quickly run through that, and I'll touch on some of the points I've made, or I have made already. The government are obviously relaxing the regulation concerning both the construction sector and the property sector, so that's very good news for all those people who are wanting to buy, sell and rent, etc. Obviously, the restrictions on social distancing still prevail, and they will continue to prevail regardless of what happens for the foreseeable future. Obviously, some of the reasons why the government's done this, obviously to kickstart the market, and particularly the property market, which is an essential part of the overall GDP of the country. And also the government is essentially funding people to stay at home. So they really need money, and there's no better way of getting money. And they're trying to claw it from wherever they can, if you think about it, than stamp duty, because that does raise a lot of income for the government, which is good. It's good for us all, basically. It means those of us who need to be staying at home and can't work from home, etc., can continue with the government funding scheme. Now, that said, also I think the government is trying to bring some sort of normality starting today, especially in our high streets, and try and bring a bit of activity, commercial activity, etc. There has been a statistic that's been flying around today that some 450,000 people have put their plans on buying, selling, renting, either on hold, or they've been in limbo, or they simply haven't progressed as much. Although having said that, just on that point, with us at Garner and Hancock, because we are working remotely, unless any other third party are not able to, assist where we require them to basically play their part, we have been doing everything, and we have been effectively working as normal, and we have been doing completions, same-day exchanges and completions. I've got a couple this week as well, basically. So we have been, although it has slightly, should we say, it's not as intense as it was, say, in March, but we are completing, and it's business as normal. Now, also from today, you've probably gathered that you can now visit estate agent offices, those which are open, including marketing suites for new builds. You can go to show homes, for example, where if you're buying a new property, etc. You can do viewings in person, for sales and rentals, etc. No doubt this will include surveys and valuations, which I touched on earlier, which have effectively been put on hold. But I don't think that's going to be more so now that this kind of restriction has been lifted, subject to, of course, the social distancing protective measures. Obviously, removal companies, no doubt you'll find it's much easier to arrange these, whereas under COVID-19, they were essentially reserved for either key workers, or removal companies were simply shutting up shop until the government restrictions were a bit more relaxed. However, a massive caution is, if there's a second spike, clearly we can go back to square one, and I hope that doesn't happen. The other point to note is most sectors, as you possibly have gathered through your reading in the media, the government plans to reopen from July onwards, basically. Now, that essentially brings me to the end of my seminar in reference the practical implications, particularly of COVID-19 on resident. But a few points just to finish off with. Whether it's COVID-19 or not, currently, or whether it's on the other side of the pandemic, we at Garner and Hancock are always happy, and like I have explained earlier, for us it has been business as normal, and we're more than happy to help anybody who needs any help, whether it's now or in the future. And our offices, for those who haven't gathered from the website, are situated in Old Isleworth, which is bordering St Margaret's in Richmond, and very easily accessible by all means of transport. And like our slogan says, which is what we prescribe to, we do look forward to being of service to you in the future and assisting you with your buying and selling your most important assets. Now, a final reminder for those of you who possibly are not aware to diarise our next webinar, which is next Wednesday, the 20th of May at 3 p.m. And Daniel Flynn, who's a partner at the firm and head of dispute resolution, will be heading that, and it will be centred around landlord and tenant, landlord's rights during lockdown. So that should be very interesting, and it will be a nice little attachment or continuation from my seminar. Now, that essentially ends my seminar, so I'm going to hand you over to Vinay, but before I do that, just to say I've got my colleague James, who I introduced at the start, and Ricky from Chase Buchanan. If they have anything to add, no doubt you'll be hearing from them. If there's any questions, please let us know. We do have a panel of all the people I've named earlier. Thank you for attending. Keep well, keep safe, and hope to speak and hear from any one of you attending soon.
Thank you, Gurdev. That was really interesting. I'm so glad that we've really got the up-to-date information right up to the point that the law changed, and we can now at least open up the property market. The headlines were particularly pertinent for today's webinar. So I have today joining me is Daniel Flynn, who is in the litigation department or dispute resolution. And there are a few questions coming through, and I wanted to quickly answer those, and also by text as well. I also want to invite Ricky here onto the platform. Ricky, I've got a couple of questions for you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good afternoon, Vinay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all keeping well.
So, Ricky, thanks for joining us. What a change in the market. My gosh, I mean, you are an estate agent who has closed their doors since lockdown. I hope you haven't lost the keys, because things are going to happen. What's going to happen now, and what are you going to do?
It's been a very unusual 7 weeks for us. It's been quite difficult to actually work from home within our industry, but we have adapted, and we've managed to do virtual valuations, keep things going on that side. We've done virtual video tours on a lot of our available stock, mostly on the stock that where the properties are vacant. It is good news that the government has allowed us to resume our business, but I think at the same time there is some mixed emotions out there. A lot of people will naturally be concerned about their safety and going out and viewings, and obviously sellers letting people into their houses where they're occupied. So for ourselves, we haven't just gone on and opened our doors today because we're allowed to. We're taking, putting the right measures in place to make sure that we protect the public and ourselves and our colleagues. So we'll be setting out some sort of rules and regulations that are going to be in-house, and then possibly be opening up our doors from Monday onwards.
So do you anticipate a lot of the estate agents doing likewise?
Absolutely. I've already heard of other agents who have already opened their doors up for business today, which is fair enough.
The question everybody's asking is, do you have enough properties on the books so that people who are ready and waiting to come onto the market, do you have these properties? Do agents have enough properties to show around?
Absolutely. We didn't seem to lose much stock during this lockdown period. Had a lot of people on hold. We were doing the video tours on a lot of the empty properties. So with ourselves in our branch in Isleworth and Osterley, we have in excess of 30 properties available, which is...
So the $1 million question, okay, this is the question really that everybody's at the sort of tip of their tongue wanting to ask. Here it is. So two points arising from this presentation. One is how quickly the market will come up. And secondly, this slight, back of your mind, this second wave, this potential issue of second lockdown. What do you anticipate? I know it's a little bit of crystal balling. What do you anticipate in your experience?
I think that's a tough one. I think we're going to have to be very cautious about how we approach business from here onwards, making sure that we look after the public and ourselves. Over this lockdown period, we've had several inquiries come through in a lot of our stock, which shows that there's still a lot of confidence within the marketplace. Surprisingly, we haven't had many abortive sales, and the ones that have fallen out of bed haven't really been for the reason around COVID-19. So that still shows that there's there is.
We want to ask you one question that again everybody's on, in their minds.
Sure.
What's the situation with price dropping and hard-nosed negotiations? Where are we on that? I mean, I know you haven't really sort of gone into the office, but you've got the feel that people are there either to renegotiate or prices have gone down. If so, any percentages you've got in mind?
It's hard to say by what percentage prices may come down by. It really comes down to the supply and demand. At the moment, there is a good amount of property still available in the market. There's still a lot of buyers interested in buying. There probably will be a lot more negotiating involved. I think the real figures will come to light maybe the second and third quarter of the year, once there's a bit more normality back in the marketplace. I think it's too early to tell. I think there's been some predictions of prices falling as much as 10%. I think it also really depends on the areas as well. With the area that we deal in, I think there's still a little bit of growth in the area. And for that reason, I don't think they will fall down as low as 10%, but only time will tell.
Thank you, Ricky. I've got one question for Gurdev, which has come through, just on this point about exchanging and completing on the same day. I mean, one question is, how can you exchange and complete on the same day if you cannot commit to the rental property until you exchange? It's a difficult one. It's a sort of chicken and egg situation, because ultimately this space that is afforded to people between an exchange and completion, they can arrange a lot of things in between. So is there anything you can say on that?
Unfortunately, there is always going to be an element of risk there.
That's one of the spanners in the work, especially with rental properties. And we get this even where people are not necessarily doing the same day exchange and they want a two-week gap, or there's a pressure on the chain to do things. I mean, essentially, in that sort of scenario, all one can really say is, unless your landlord plays ball and is practical and is understanding, and you can have some sort of arrangement with your landlord, clearly he wants to get tenants in as soon as possible. He doesn't want the uncertainty. But you do get landlords out there, if you explain the situation, you give the notice, but Daniel might have something to say on this, whether it's proper to do that or not. But I have seen people in writing say to the landlord, we'll give you the notice how to vacate the property now, looking ahead, and we're doing the same day exchange completion. But in the event it doesn't happen, then that notice is retracted, basically. Obviously, the landlord would have to agree to something like that, right? But it's a very difficult situation. In that sort of scenario, it's a simple matter of basically, unless you get cooperation from your landlord, sitting it out and getting, I suppose the other thing you can do is to get everybody else in the chain to be patient and wait until such time as you are able to.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring in Haj Pada, who's one of our attendees. Haj, just welcome. I know you're a surveyor, and I wanted to bring you in just because you're dealing with obviously inspection of properties. Haj, can you bring something to the table?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, we were valuing and inspecting at full speed. Since
Oops, sorry, I think Haj, you're really breaking up. I'm really sorry.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yeah, do carry on, otherwise I may have to stop you. Haj,
okay. No, okay, yeah, stop me if you have to. Right, so since April, inspections have slowed down, but where we can inspect, we are valuing and inspecting using our best practices, which is wearing PPE, etc. And if the property is vacant, that's fantastic. If the property is not vacant, I have asked people to step outside if possible, or vacate the property for me to go in. I think that's still a way that we're going to be doing this in the future. And I can see the RICS have given all of us advice on this. And I think if all the surveyors, established surveyors, are doing this, then we should be able to inspect the properties that we know of. A friend who is head at Barclays Valuers, and I think they're all going to go out from tomorrow onwards at full speed again, following that sort of guidance. Now, in terms of market value, interesting what was heard earlier. I agree that I think it's not possible to say whether there's been a drop in value, and the definition of market obviously is still the same, that it's a deal between two willing parties. Simplified that quickly. Now, as long as the seller and the buyer agree a price, whether that's depicted by demand or supply, or whether it's depicted by COVID-19, I think that is still going to be the value that is agreed, and that is going to be set.
Sorry, Haj, we're going to have to lose you on there. Sorry, because we can't hear you. Thank you so much, Haj. That was really good, because that really people want to know whether the valuations provided by banks and institutions were holding up a lot of the transactions. I think that was what was going on, certainly from our experience. I want to bring in Daniel Flynn here in dispute resolution. We've had one really major issue, Daniel, which is the risks of other side. We had one just recently. The other side solicitors went bust. And we were in a terrible situation. You know, Gurdev certainly mentioned this. You know, there are solicitors who are unsafe out there. What can we do to mitigate the situation?
Unfortunately, there's not much control that one can have over the other side's choice of representation, as long as people take on sensible solicitors who've got an established practice and who are members of the relevant professional bodies. There should be a degree of protection, but ultimately this is kind of an outside event and it's very difficult to predict. So your conveyancing solicitor would be in charge of making sure that all of the parties to the transaction, the buyer, the seller, and any finance providers, are not going to go bust. The solicitor going bust is something of a left field surprise.
Well, we had one. We had one last week. We were ready to exchange and complete on the same day, and the solicitors went bust. So we can't mitigate that, but I think you could be rest assured, certainly from the SRA's point of view, that client money is safe. That's where it is. Thank you, everybody. I know there's more questions which are coming through, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. We will answer some of your questions which have been put to us, and you can, of course, direct those questions to our panelists directly. We'll send an email over to you after the webinar. Thanks very much for joining us. It really is, the subject is so fresh, literally off the press, that I'm so glad it was timely. Next week is Daniel going to deal with landlord and tenant disputes, particularly landlords trying to recover rents and their rights during lockdown. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that's, particularly now this whole thing is going to extend till September, October and onwards. So thank you, everybody. Please carry on with your questions, and we will answer those questions and also send you a recording when this is prepared. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day and keep safe. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, everyone.